we make our way around Decatur is something we think about a lot, and something we've got very strong feelings about. Because before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, when our strategic planning process was getting underway, nearly 800 Decatur residents committed to a series of roundtable discussions exploring their likes, frustrations, and ambitions for our city. And you know what? Transportation and mobility were the things they discussed the most. The issues they raised are now being tested and refined in our virtual forums. Opinions are varied, but two seemingly incompatible truths have emerged. The vast majority of Decatur residents believe in equal access for all and support the city's efforts to become more accommodating to all forms of travel. But at the same time, everyone seems to agree. Most of us rely on cars to do the things we need to do, and congestion frustrates our ability to do those things efficiently, testing our patience, stealing our time, and reducing our quality of life. When all is said and done, our streets and thoroughfares are the most visible form of public space. How we divvy up that space and who we accommodate through design and infrastructure is a choice every community must make. And to further complicate the mix, how do different approaches affect progress on other big picture issues, like affordability or climate action? What does a successful approach to transportation look like in a city of 25,000 people within a metropolitan region of nearly 6 million?
Good afternoon. I'm Jack Kittle, chair of the Decatur Active Living Advisory Board. I've lived on Garden Lane near the intersection of Claremont and Scott for 34 years. Today I want to give a quick overview of transportation planning in our city. Decatur has a long history of thoughtful transportation planning with extensive community involvement. 6 citywide plans over the past 15 years have had significant transportation components. Beginning with the 2007 Community Transportation Plan, we have sought to create a safe, integrated transportation system that promotes bicycling and walking as a viable alternative to driving, increases connectivity, and promotes equity for everyone. Hundreds of people have contributed to these planning efforts. As a community, we've decided that we need alternatives to driving alone as we invest in our transportation network. The city has completed many projects to implement these plans. These include the Claremont and McDonough Railroad crossings, the McDonough Street Greenway, the Commerce Drive Path, and the Talley Street sidewalks and traffic signal, along with Parkwood and other neighborhood traffic calming. We've also done some smaller projects like painted crosswalks downtown and sidewalk maintenance. And other projects are in the works. Decatur's official transportation plans, especially the 2018 Community Transportation Plan, or CTP, recommend many more transportation improvements in the city. These include a network of bike and walking trails, intersection improvements, traffic calming, ways to address new technologies, and a focus on safety through the Vision Zero framework. Over the years, I've had a few personal lessons learned. First, Decatur's transportation network is quite complex. There are many needs that appear to be in conflict and require thoughtful planning to find optimal solutions. Second, our transportation system is expensive and time-consuming to maintain and enhance. Projects that seem simple can have price tags in the 6- and 7-figure range, and timelines for projects can be in the decades. Our conversation today will help guide the city's transportation spending over the next 10 years, including what kind of transportation investments should be our first priority. Third, there are many government agencies involved in transportation. GDOT controls many of our major roads. MARTA and the Clifton Corridor provide transit services. DeKalb County owns our traffic light infrastructure. These organizations don't always share the same priorities and goals as the city, or are mostly focused on moving people through Decatur. Finally, Decatur has a long history of focusing on active transportation, which is healthy for individuals, the community, and our planet. I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and to our breakout group discussions as we discuss mobility priorities for the next decade.
I just wanted to throw a few statistics, but this was looking at the number of Georgians with licenses. So 32% of people don't actually drive, don't have licenses. That's based in 2018 numbers. So you also have to remember that you're having to think about transportation choices, and a car option is not necessarily available. Now, if you think about it, that's not surprising, that number, because that's going to be anybody under 16. If somebody is senior and not able to drive anymore, if anybody has a disability, or there's a growing percentage of people that just are not interested in getting their license. So that's just important to keep in mind, that a city like Decatur has to accommodate all kinds of situations. And then there are quite a few households with no vehicle, or even nowadays you're seeing a larger number of households going down to one vehicle. So it's just important to keep those kinds of things in mind when you're having these conversations. Something I just wanted to share about network connectivity, because I think it gets lost a lot, that, and it was sort of mentioned in one of the videos here, about how you use space is pretty important. So technically, if you're thinking about a network, the network on the left here is 4 lanes of traffic going north and south and 6 lanes going east and west. That's the same number of lanes on the right. So you have 4 going north-south and 6 going east-west. Same amount of asphalt, same amount of lanes. But the outcomes and the operations of those 2 networks are going to be very different. You're definitely going to be stuck at a signal and you're going to be delayed in the network on the left. You're going to get there faster in the network on the right. And so it is important to think about these things and understand that having other options and spreading it out is pretty important. The network on the right is also much better for pedestrians, because you have more frequent locations that you can cross at. And it's actually more optimal for transit service, because the vehicles can travel through different patterns and different routes. The one on the left, everybody's going to be stuck at the intersection and it takes longer to clear. This is a series of slides that gets at a point here that I think is valuable, just to understand that your cone of focus when you're driving changes a lot when you're actually going faster. And that's really important for a couple of reasons. So I'm just going to go through these slides. You can see that this is kind of your view shed if you were the driver at 15 miles per hour. But when you go to 20 miles per hour, you start to have to hone in a little bit closer. When you go 25 miles per hour, you're having to focus even further. You've got less of a field of vision, if you will. And then at 30 miles per hour, you're focused even tighter. And the reason why I bring that up is, obviously from a safety standpoint, that's really important. Your field of vision is going to be different at a higher speed. So there's a safety implication there, but also your experience of a community. So can you window shop? Can you see things along the way? If you're on a faster street, you can't really take in that community. You can't take in the sights as well. So there's also an experience that's reduced the faster you're going as well. So we all are designing for cars. That's not an unusual thing, but there is a trade-off. And I think that's just the most important thing. My hope was that y'all can keep in mind, there's a constant trade-off here. So you don't have to read all the text, but you get the idea that on the top is freeway access, and on the bottom is local road access. And the trade-off is that on a freeway, you're going faster, and you're getting there faster, but your access points are much fewer. So you have limited access, but you're going faster. And of course, at the local level, you're having much more access, but you're going slower. And so when you are designing for the fastest, you are trading off the access and that experience that we talked about too. So there's this balancing act of how much do we need to have the speed, and how much are we trying to accommodate that speed, and how much do we want to be for the community and the access points. Designing for cars also is really significant when it comes to pedestrian survival. This statistic has been around and shown for a lot of presentations, but it really is very, I guess, sobering when you realize how big of a difference the safety impacts are from 20 to 30 to 40. That's not, when you're driving, 20 to 30 doesn't feel like much, but it can be a very, very big difference. So it's at 20 miles per hour, 9 out of 10 pedestrians will survive, but at 40, only 1 will survive. And so that's really important to keep in mind too, that when you're designing for streets and speed, there is definitely going to be some danger for that, for pedestrians. And then the livability, and this is what y'all have been working on for a long time in Decatur, is having a beautiful, livable community, but that there is always that trade-off in the seconds for cars, and you know, how do we balance that out? And I would say that I've dealt for many years with travel demand models and listening to traffic modeling, and it's necessary, but just know it really is about just saving a few seconds, and it doesn't really equate to major differences sometimes. And so your trade-off is often your livability is suffering, and that's kind of what y'all are having to tackle right now. It's not easy, but it's important to keep that in mind. And then the graphic on the right here is kind of a joke. It's a joke on the word improvement. So a lot of times in the transportation world, you can hear talk about this improvement, this traffic and transportation improvement. And so the graphic on the right is talking about, well, once the street is improved, it's going to be right here, basically at her front door. And so it's just important to think about who the improvement is for. What is the improvement for? Is the roadway improvement good for cars, but is it at a major social cost or livability cost or some environmental impact? Also, I'm glad they mentioned the monetary cost. One thing I realize is most people don't understand how much some of these projects cost and how much that it relates to your taxes. And so understanding that those roadway improvements, every time we want to widen and improve, it does have a lot of costs as well. And then the costs for the other things that we care about are this viability of transit, the speed, the crossing time, the space for cyclists, and the economic development. So I wanted to kind of bring that a little bit into the picture too. Make sure you think about that. And this is housing and transportation costs as a percentage of income. And I just grabbed it for Decatur. So the average for all of the city of Decatur, combining the costs, is 58%. So 58% of the household income is spent on housing and transportation in Decatur. The image on the left breaks it down by census block. So you can see there's a variety from 25% to 79%. So there's quite a variety there when you add those up. But the reason I wanted to make sure people think about this is when we design places that require people to have a car to get around, we are basically taking away from their housing income, from their budget that they have as well at home. So if we can free up transportation costs, if we don't have to burden people with high transportation costs, there's a lot more money for housing and all the other expenses we have. And it's really important to think about those costs together. So on the economic development side, I just wanted to leave a few precedent examples. Philadelphia, 30th Street Station, the one on the left, it was a pretty devoid place. People would try to get out of there fast. Nobody hung out there if they didn't want to. They redesigned the street. They didn't get rid of cars, but they definitely expanded the space for pedestrians and cyclists, and they program a lot of activity there, and they've had tremendous success at that location. Times Square, you know, I use this example because people think New York, if you know, the traffic in New York is kind of everybody's famous for. They closed it off. People thought it was a little crazy at first. But their pedestrian injuries are down on this particular piece of Times Square from 42nd to 47th. They studied before and after. The injuries were down 35%, travel times improved, and flagship stores open. The retail rents did double, so it is important to consider if you're trying to keep your local small businesses, you've got to look out for them in this process as well, though. And if New York City was too large of an idea, Chattanooga did it. So this is the riverfront in Chattanooga. This is what it looked like before. They changed the cross section, and then they have a lot of programming and a lot more success with their riverfront. So I just wanted to share that from an economic development perspective too, how you spend this space, how you use it, what you do with it can be very important. And I'm going to leave this last slide here. This is from an old colleague, David Green, from Perkins and Will. He drew this, but it's a really good description. As we all know, that distance between stairs or steps can be the same, but it can be a lot harder. So just the small difference in how something is designed can make a big impact on our lives. And that's really what you're thinking about, is that small choices about your city and its physical environment do have a big impact on your lives. And I'm impressed with y'all putting your time and energy towards this. I'm looking forward to seeing the results.
Thank you so much, Heather, for those slides and for that information. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Charles Brown.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Heather, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for those words and for kicking things off as well. My name is Charles T. Brown. I am originally from rural Mississippi, but I spent many a days and weekends in Atlanta as well as Decatur as a young child. And more recently, as a professional, each year working with the CDC and the NACDD, I make a trip at least once a year to host and be part of the faculty there for the Walkability Action Institute. What I would like to do right now is build upon Heather's presentation by addressing the who and the what in terms of the different modalities and why mobility matters. And in discussing why mobility matters, I'm going to give you 12 action items that you could use right now to center equity and inclusion in the 2020 Decatur Strategic Plan. In order to do so, I think it's important first to explain what is meant by equity. Equity involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives. But in addition to that, equity also is the presence of justice and fairness within these procedures, the processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. This strategic planning process that you're currently undergoing, I can tell even from afar that it is definitely one of justice and fairness. But we can't stop there. Doing this equity work also requires an understanding of the underlying or the root causes of inequalities and oppression within our society, even within the context of transportation and mobility, or probably more so within the context of transportation and mobility. But we can't just look at it through the root causes. We also have to consider both historical and contemporary realities, which is that equity also requires a consideration of the various social identities. When we have conversations about the who or the what or the how, oftentimes we talk about gender, we discuss the importance of age, we talk about ability or disability. We less often talk about the importance of race and ethnicity in these conversations, as well as how people need to commute to and from different destinations based upon their race and their ethnicity. So then the question is, how can we together, create a safe, equitable, and inclusive system for all in Decatur? First and foremost, we must center racial equity. And in doing so, we are to create, in addition to this strategic planning process, a racial equity action plan. And this racial equity action plan will show how committed we are in the city in not only embracing racial equity within the city, but also institutionalizing it. And that is important for many reasons. First of which, if you see here on the map, this is basically where the different racial populations live in the greater Atlanta area. Decatur is shown here in the yellow box. What this map is showing, blue represents where the majority of the white population lives. Green represents where the Black population lives. Purple represents where the Hispanic population lives. And the pink and the other colors represent where Asian and other Americans are living. To quickly tell you what this map is showing, what it shows quite vividly is racial residential segregation. And where there is segregation, there is inequities, there are disparities. And as you can see here, for the most part, Decatur is shown in the blue zone, meaning that it is, for the most part, disproportionately white. We must also, action number two, prioritize investments in maintenance in minority and low-income communities. And by investments, we mean investments in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. You've done a tremendous job over the past years putting money into bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, but it's important to remember that you still have a segment of your population that identifies as racial minorities, whom are low income and who are heavily dependent on this infrastructure. And so as you consider the balance between whether you would be an auto-centric city or one that maximizes multimodalism, I ask that you consider investing in the minority and the low income areas. But it's not just enough to invest in them. You must also continue to maintain them. Because if you don't maintain them, you'll continue to perpetuate the traffic violence that has been inflicted upon these communities disproportionately. And then third, in these processes, as well as your transportation decision-making processes, it's of critical importance that it be full and fair participation by your racialized minority groups. I ask you, as you've done your strategic planning process, to consider the demographics of those who have been involved and to see if you're actually hearing from the whole of Decatur. This is important because you're creating a plan for the future, and we want to make sure that all of our plans ensure the full and fair participation of all parties, but in particular, the racialized minority groups, as they are disproportionately more likely to be hit by a car, suffer from the impacts of gentrification, displacement, and have adverse health outcomes. Fourth, in these processes and as you build out your system, it is important to foster more equitable treatment of diverse languages in the public sphere. Your city isn't as diverse as a lot of cities are, but with this new success comes more and more migration into the city. And as that happens, the diversity in culture and language is ever present. In doing so and making sure that people are reached and feel welcome, it's important that language, equity, and access become your calling card. In addition to that, it is important to document and increase the mobility and access for elderly and persons with disabilities. We must meet separately with these groups to understand what their mobility challenges are. And when it comes to persons with disabilities, we must not limit that just to persons with physical disabilities, but we must also consider the cognitive disabilities as well. Consistent with that, there are two other populations that we must also consider to understand or deepen our understanding of their unique behavior and usage differences, one being women and female-headed households. We know in transportation and planning that most of our systems have been male-centric, and thus the result of those male-centric professions, we now have built environments which are built with the male in mind, not so much the female or those who are non-binary. And so what we must do then is meet with these groups, conduct audits with them to understand ways in which we can increase their safety and mobilities on our roadways. And the same is true for our foreign-born populations who culturally see transportation and mobility much different than the dominant society. So again, as we go deeper into this process, as we consider the decisions we're making, engage with these foreign-born populations to understand their barriers. And then as you are dealing and addressing with this beautiful growth and prosperity that is happening, don't forget to always evaluate and mitigate your unintended consequences of this improved mobility and access, which usually manifests itself through gentrification and displacement. This is important because trees planted in minority communities mature just in time for gentrification to take place. So as you're moving these investments, being more equitable and inclusive in your distributions of your resources, your programs, and your plans, please also actively to make sure that you're putting in place ways to prevent gentrification and displacement from becoming an even larger problem in the city. And then also, if you have a chance or an opportunity, it's important that you consider what impact zoning and land use has already done to the city in terms of segregation, in terms of not all people feeling welcome into a particular place. So it's important that you have as an action your ability to analyze the impact of past and current zoning and land use decisions. And then while doing this, please continue to involve law enforcement to ensure that you're safeguarding against discriminatory enforcement. Because what's a city if you have the most beautiful infrastructure, modality is at an all-time high, you have affordable housing, et cetera, but people do not feel safe in that environment. This is a reality all across America, but it could become a particular problem in Decatur as well. Please consider consider the fact that minority males such as myself, regardless of income or ability, are 2.5 times more likely to be stopped and killed by law enforcement. So we want to make sure that we are addressing the physical in terms of infrastructure, but also the social physical when we're doing this work as well, or should I say the social political. And then also, as my colleague has said here, please consider the impact or the connections between transportation and climate change. And one of the things that I would like to recommend is that you start to go against what a lot of cities are doing, and that is please discourage the expansion of drive-through restaurants in your city. More and more restaurants are using COVID as an opportunity now to expand their capacity. This is going to have negative consequences on the environment, but also the health, safety, and well-being of residents in your city. Not only low-income residents, but also seniors and persons with disabilities as well. And then I must also add that from an aesthetic standpoint, it would take away the beauty and the character of Decatur as a whole. So I understand the importance for redevelopment, economic development, but please don't do it at the cost of the beauty and the safety and the well-being of your city. And then lastly, it's important that you ensure equitable and inclusive access for all in your parks and open spaces. Why am I saying this? Because proximity to parks is not access to parks. Typically, the groups that I've spoken about are proximate to a park, but due to infrastructure reasons or the lack thereof, or due to some of these social political issues, they don't feel welcome or they don't feel safe traversing to and from these locations. And of course, what's a park if it can't be accessed at night? In my personal opinion, any park that isn't accessible at night is wholly inaccessible in totality, I would say. Here's my personal information. I'll end there. My time is up. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And thank you.